On May 30, 2014, the last Dunlop tire rolled off a production line in Birmingham, and a century of industrial history ended with almost no one watching. That silence is part of what makes this story so unsettling. Dunlop was not some forgotten workshop or minor brand. It was one of the names that seemed built into Britain itself, stamped onto cars, aircraft, racing circuits, factory floors, and the skyline of Birmingham. At its height, it helped define what industrial confidence looked like. So how does something that large, that familiar, that deeply rooted, simply slip away? Not through one spectacular disaster, not through one single fatal mistake, but through a chain of decisions that looked manageable at the time, until the empire they held together was gone. This is the story of how Dunlop helped build modern Britain, how Birmingham turned rubber into power, and how one of the country's most permanent industrial names survived long after the world that made it had disappeared. The story does not begin in a boardroom. It begins with discomfort. In 1887, John Boyd Dunlop was a 50-year-old Scottish veterinary surgeon living in Belfast. He was not one of the Victorian age's grand industrial showmen. He did not arrive trailing financiers, patents, and a theory of world markets. He was a practical man, a local professional. The sort of person history often pushes to the margins once larger personalities arrive. What bothered him was simple. His son's tricycle rode badly over Belfast's rough streets. Solid rubber wheels jolted the machine over the cobbles. The child felt every bump. Dunlop, wanting to solve the immediate problem in front of him, experimented. He wrapped the wheels in rubber, inflated them with air, and discovered something transformative almost by accident. Cushioning changed everything. A wheel that gave slightly to the road did not merely improve comfort. It changed speed, efficiency, and endurance. That is the strange thing about industrial revolutions. They often begin as local irritations. By 1888, Dunlop had patented the pneumatic tire. Within a year, the invention had acquired the thing every invention needs if it is going to survive: public proof. A Belfast cyclist named Willie Hume began racing on Dunlop's tires and started beating men who, by ordinary standards, should have beaten him. The advantage was visible. Riders felt it. Crowds noticed it. Newspapers wrote about it. A useful curiosity became a commercial opportunity. And this is where the second essential figure enters the story: Harvey Ducross. Where John Boyd Dunlop was careful, Ducross was energetic. Where Dunlop saw an elegant solution to a narrow problem, Ducross saw a product with a global future. He understood something John Boyd Dunlop either did not understand or did not particularly wish to pursue: that modern transport would eventually belong to whoever controlled the wheel. The business that followed was not built by the inventor alone. It was built by the alliance, uneasy, uneven, but historically decisive, between invention and commercial aggression. Dunlop lent his name and his discovery. Ducross built the machinery of expansion around it. In 1889, the business structure that would evolve into Dunlop Rubber began taking shape, and almost immediately the pattern of the next century became clear. The name Dunlop would travel everywhere. The man himself would not. John Boyd Dunlop withdrew from the company by the mid-1890s. He did not remain to preside over the empire. He did not become one of those industrial patriarchs who dominate both the company and its mythology. His name became bigger than his role. That matters, because from the beginning Dunlop was a business defined less by a single founder's enduring vision than by what later managers, engineers, and financiers chose to do with an invention that had already proved its worth. The product was brilliant. The company that grew around it would have to decide, generation after generation, whether it was still brave enough to deserve what it had inherited. Early tyre production spread quickly. Dublin first, Coventry after that. Overseas manufacturing began astonishingly early. The company expanded across borders before most British firms had properly learned to think in international terms. That speed can make the story feel inevitable in hindsight, but it was not. It reflected a hard industrial truth. Once the pneumatic tyre proved itself, delay became dangerous. By the opening years of the 20th century, Dunlop had shifted its strategic center toward Birmingham. That move was no accident. Birmingham was one of the great workshops of industrial Britain. Metal, tools, machinery, skilled labor, canals, rail, engineering culture, supplier networks. If you intended to make something at scale in the early 20th century, Birmingham offered the infrastructure and the workforce to do it. It was a city that knew how to turn technical skill into mass output. So Dunlop acquired land on the eastern edge of the city and began building what would become Fort Dunlop. The nickname came first, the myth after. Workers arriving along the canal are said to have used local shorthand that hardened over time into Fort Dunlop. The more the site grew, the more the name felt inevitable. It really did look like a fortification. Not graceful, not ornamental. Massive, assertive, an industrial wall planted in the landscape. Construction expanded during the First World War, when demand for transport materials surged. Tires were no longer simply an accessory to bicycles and the rising motor trade. They were part of the logistics of modern war. The factory that rose in Birmingham was built in an age that measured seriousness in concrete, brick, acreage, and visible scale. If a company mattered, it built something that could be seen from miles away. Fort Dunlop could be. Its great interwar building, designed by Sidney Stott and W. Gibbings, dominated the approach roads and eventually the motorway skyline. It was a structure made to communicate permanence. Not the permanence of a cathedral, perhaps, but the permanence of industrial confidence, still one of the most powerful architectural languages Britain ever invented. That confidence was not empty. Dunlop's business was expanding in tandem with motor transport itself. More bicycles meant more tires. More motor cars meant more tires. More trucks, more buses, more military vehicles, more aircraft. Every extension of mobility enlarged the market. A company that could master rubber compounds, manufacturing processes, and distribution networks was not selling a niche product. It was furnishing motion. And Birmingham became the place where that ambition took physical form. In time, the site covered hundreds of acres. At its peak, the wider Fort Dunlop complex employed around 10,000 people in Birmingham alone. The factory was not just a workplace. It was a territorial fact. A city can contain many industries. Only a few industries begin to shape how a city imagines itself. Dunlop did that to Birmingham. When people remember Dunlop now, they usually remember tires. That is understandable. It is also incomplete. The mid-century Dunlop empire was not a narrow tire business with a famous building attached to it. It was a rubber empire in the fuller imperial sense of the word, diversified, international, deeply embedded in multiple sectors of ordinary life, and large enough that its products often vanished into the background of the nation that used them. Tires, of course, were the center of gravity. Dunlop became one of the dominant names in British tire supply and a major global manufacturer. But rubber does not stay politely in one market. It proliferates. It gets into transport, sport, clothing, household goods, military systems, industrial components. Dunlop followed that logic. Wellington boots, rubber flooring, tennis equipment, industrial products. Aircraft tires. Motorsport. The company diversified in ways that reflected both caution and confidence. Caution, because diversification spreads risk. Confidence, because only a very strong company assumes it can extend its name into adjacent worlds and make the public accept the transition. By the post-war years, Dunlop had become one of Britain's largest companies. In 1946, it employed tens of thousands across the world. By the mid-1950s, the number was around 100,000. For a period, it held nearly half the British tire market by value. Britain, meanwhile, was one of the world's largest car producers and the largest exporter of cars. Many of those vehicles left factories riding on Dunlop. That scale altered the company's meaning. A small or medium manufacturer lives or dies by a product. A company on Dunlop's scale becomes a system. It begins to tie together plantations, laboratories, shipping, warehousing, labor relations, export markets, military procurement, sporting prestige, and the daily assumptions of ordinary consumers. When people pulled on a pair of boots or watched a race or saw a tire advertisement, they were not just seeing merchandise. They were seeing the visible surface of an industrial network that stretched far beyond Birmingham. That network reached into the British Empire as well. Dunlop secured rubber supplies through plantation interests in Malaya. By the interwar period, its landholdings there were enormous. Raw material moved from colonial landscapes to British industry, and from British industry back out into world markets as finished goods. That chain of extraction, processing, and sale was part of what made the empire so profitable and so resilient for so long. It also placed Dunlop squarely inside the larger structure of British imperial economics, whether later corporate storytelling found that uncomfortable or not. By the 1950s, Dunlop was not merely a successful firm. It was one of those companies that come to stand for a national industrial style. Engineering-led, export-oriented, heavy, serious, deeply tied to work, and apparently too large to fail in any meaningful sense. Apparently. Dunlop's rise did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because the 20th century became an age of wheels, engines, speed, and total logistics. Before mass motoring, the tire business was important. After mass motoring, it was infrastructural. Once a modern economy commits itself to vehicles, private cars, buses, lorries, military transport, aircraft, racing machines, it quietly commits itself to an enormous supporting world of components. Steel matters. Fuel matters. Rubber matters. Without tires, movement remains theory. The First World War accelerated that truth. So did the Second. Military vehicles needed tires. Aircraft needed tires. Wartime transport needed reliability, replacement schedules, supply chains, rubber compounds capable of surviving punishment. A company like Dunlop did not merely benefit from those demands. It was shaped by them. Wartime scale trains organizations into habits of urgency and mass throughput. It teaches them to think in contracts, logistics, output, and replacement at a level peacetime markets do not always require. Then came the long post-war expansion of civilian motoring. For millions of people, the 20th century was experienced as a progressive increase in mobility. Buses, lorries, delivery fleets, family cars, motorways, touring, commercial haulage, aviation. Dunlop rode that increase and, for a time, helped define it. The company's association with motorsport added another layer of prestige. Racing is often dismissed as marketing wrapped in glamour, but for tire manufacturers it is something more serious. It is where performance becomes public. Win there, and the whole brand acquires technical authority. Dunlop did win there. Repeatedly. Its tires were present in racing successes that fed directly into public confidence. If the fastest cars in the world trusted your product, ordinary motorists could do the same. That was the implicit contract. Racing burnished the myth. The factory made the myth economically meaningful. So when people later asked how a company this dominant could lose its footing, they were not really asking about a middling manufacturer. They were asking about a company that had once fused war, sport, export, engineering, and ordinary civilian life into a single industrial identity. The bigger the myth, the harder the decline is to believe while it is happening. To understand Dunlop properly, you have to leave the boardroom and stand where the workers stood. Imagine Birmingham in the 1950s. The morning shift begins before dawn has entirely given up. Men and women arrive in numbers so great that the movement itself becomes a local ritual. Whole families are tied to the plant. One generation enters through the gates after another. Streets nearby live on Dunlop wages. Shops live on Dunlop wages. Pubs, bus routes, schools, clubs, local reputations, these too, in different ways, live on Dunlop wages. Industrial historians sometimes talk about employment ecosystems. Workers in places like Erdington did not need the phrase. They lived the reality. A giant employer is never only an employer. It is an organizer of time. It decides when the district wakes, when it travels, when it spends, when it worries, when it feels secure, and when it begins to feel that something is wrong. At its height, the Fort Dunlop complex was often described as a city within a city. The phrase is common enough to become cliché, but here it deserves to be taken literally. The site had its own internal rhythms, rules, hierarchies, departments, and social culture. A place that employs thousands on one site cannot function as a mere collection of machines. It becomes a social world. There were works sports clubs, canteens, associations, skill hierarchies, shift loyalties, the kind of workplace memory that lasts because it was repetitive enough to be communal and demanding enough to matter. Former workers from British industrial giants often remember not just labor, but texture, the smell, the noise, the banter, the routines, the exact feeling of walking the same path every morning for 20 years. Dunlop inspired that kind of memory. The building itself mattered because it was big enough to become part of personal geography. You did not merely work at Fort Dunlop. You oriented yourself by it. It stood there over the landscape, and its existence seemed to confirm that the industrial order beneath it would continue. It is easy, in retrospect, to talk only about the company's strategic errors and ignore the dignity that mass manufacturing once carried for the people inside it. But that dignity was real. There is a difference between earning a wage anywhere and earning it in a place that makes something tangible and globally recognized. If you spent your working life turning materials into tires that went onto British cars, racing cars, lorries, aircraft, and exports, you were not participating in an abstraction. You could point at the road and see your industry moving over it. That kind of work creates loyalty. It also creates vulnerability. Because when a place like this declines, what disappears is not just employment. What disappears is a social world organized around the assumption that making things will continue to anchor the future. It is difficult to explain to a post-industrial society what it meant to work in a place like Fort Dunlop without sounding nostalgic by accident. That is a danger worth resisting, because factory life was not soft. It was repetitive, disciplined, noisy, often physically punishing, and governed by systems people accepted partly because there was no point pretending there were not systems. Large manufacturing works were built on sequence, timing, authority, and throughput. A tyre does not care about sentiment. It demands process. And yet memory clings to such places not because they were easy, but because they were substantial. You knew where you were in the chain. You knew who depended on your section getting it right. You knew which foreman could be trusted, which shift moved quickest, which room smelled strongest, which stage in production was hottest, dirtiest, most exacting. You knew the men and women who would still be standing beside you next week, next month, perhaps next decade. Workplaces that run for generations create a kind of social thickness. They are not anonymous. Rubber manufacturing had its own physical world. Heat, compounds, pressure, curing, inspection, the strange combination of chemistry and brute repetition that so much 20th century production required. The product leaving the line looked clean and finished. The path to get there was altogether more demanding. And the company knew it needed more than wages to hold such a world together. Like many large British manufacturers of the era, Dunlop cultivated an institutional life around the job. Canteens, works clubs, sports, welfare provisions, internal hierarchies of belonging. Some of this was practical. Some of it was paternal. Some of it was simply the recognition that if you employed people in their thousands, you were not managing labor in the narrow sense. You were managing a miniature society. This is why closures wound so deeply. A redundancy notice at a giant plant does not only remove income, it ejects a person from a whole ecosystem of recognition. Men and women who had known exactly who they were within the factory system suddenly had to explain themselves to a labor market that often valued neither the specificity nor the pride of what they knew. When historians discuss deindustrialization through statistics alone, this is the layer that escapes. They can count the jobs lost. They cannot quite count the confidence structure those jobs sustained. The great collapses of industry are rarely as mysterious as they later sound. By the early 1960s, the tire market was changing. Michelin had pushed hard into radial technology, especially steel-belted radial construction, and the implications were not subtle. Radials offered durability, efficiency, and performance advantages that increasingly mattered in a competitive global market. This was not some obscure laboratory curiosity that only a handful of specialists understood. Major tire firms could see where the industry was moving. Dunlop could see it too. That is what makes the next part of the story so uncomfortable. The company was not ambushed by a future nobody could have predicted. It confronted a future it understood and balked at paying for. Retooling a massive industrial operation is expensive. Really expensive. Not expensive in the abstract language of consultancy presentations, but expensive in the real language of machinery, training, downtime, capital allocation, and shareholder anxiety. The more successful a firm has been in one manufacturing system, the more painful it can be to reorganize itself around another. Existing assets become arguments against change. Yesterday's triumph becomes tomorrow's inertia. Dunlop chose a cheaper path. Rather than commit fully and early to the steel-belted radial future, the company leaned toward textile radial solutions that seemed less financially punishing in the short term. It was a compromise that allowed the business to preserve comfort for a little longer. Preserve margins. Preserve familiar processes. Preserve the mood of a company that was still large enough to believe it had more time than it really did. This is where industrial decline stops being romantic and becomes brutally technical. Whole futures can pivot on whether a board decides to spend heavily enough, early enough, on the right process. The public usually sees the decline years later, in closures and redundancies. But the real turning point often happens much earlier, in a meeting room, when the language is still prudent, sensible, responsible. And once that decision is made, the consequences may take years to become visible, but they begin immediately. Michelin and others kept advancing. Customer expectations moved. Productivity comparisons became more painful. The gap between Dunlop's reputation and Dunlop's underlying competitive position widened. For a while, the company could continue drawing strength from its name, scale, relationships, and legacy. But a reputation, however immense, cannot permanently out-argue a product trend. Dunlop had built one of the greatest industrial brands in Britain. It now faced the classic curse of industrial greatness, the difficulty of cannibalizing your own past quickly enough to deserve a future. Large companies can carry hidden weakness for years. Then one event makes the weakness visible to everyone who matters. For Dunlop, one such event arrived in 1970. Fort Dunlop went on strike, and the consequences reached beyond the gates. Britain's major vehicle manufacturers depended on tyre supply. British Leyland, in particular, had relied heavily on Dunlop. When supply becomes uncertain, customers do not need to hate you to begin planning around you. They simply need to fear dependency. That is what happened. The strike helped convince key customers that relying too heavily on a single supplier was dangerous. Dual sourcing, the corporate phrase is dry, but the effect is devastating, became more attractive. Once a customer that large decides it must not be wholly dependent on you, something fundamental has shifted. The relationship may continue. Orders may still come. But exclusivity is gone, and the old confidence goes with it. Dunlop recorded its first loss. That mattered not only financially, but psychologically. Giant industrial firms depend partly on numbers and partly on aura. The aura says, this is still the center of gravity, this is still the reliable giant, this is still the place the market bends around. Losses puncture aura. So do strikes that expose fragility. It would be far too simple to blame workers for the company's later collapse. Industrial disputes in post-war Britain were often symptoms of broader tensions rather than isolated acts of self-destruction. But it would be equally foolish to pretend the strike did not matter. It mattered because it alerted major customers to a risk they could no longer afford to ignore. The wall had cracked. And as often happens, the company responded not with a clear, brutal strategic reset, but with something more complicated, more elegant on paper, and more disastrous in reality. In 1971, Dunlop entered into a major tie-up with Pirelli. On paper, it looked like the kind of move serious business people admire. Rational, international, strategic, modern. The global tire industry was becoming more competitive. American giants loomed. Continental Europe mattered more. Scale mattered more. Technology mattered more. The old self-sufficient national champion model looked shakier by the year. A closer arrangement with Pirelli promised broader reach, stronger continental positioning, shared resources, and the appearance of renewed momentum. The problem with many rescue strategies is that they solve the problem the board is most comfortable naming, not necessarily the problem the business is actually suffering from. The Dunlop-Pirelli arrangement was structurally complex and operationally fraught. It did not produce clean command. It produced entanglement. Two corporate cultures, two strategic traditions, two power centers, one increasingly awkward structure. The hoped-for benefits of scale were offset by managerial friction and strategic drift. If a company is already struggling to make hard decisions fast enough, adding another layer of complexity is a dangerous kind of optimism. Losses mounted. Pirelli operations within the combined structure performed badly year after year. Dunlop's own European tire business remained under intense pressure. Modernization demanded money. Debt made money more precious. Asset sales, once unthinkable for a business of this stature, began to move from theoretical to necessary. At this point, the tragedy of Dunlop becomes hard to separate from the tragedy of much post-war British manufacturing more generally. Executives were often trying to solve real global competitive problems inside a national industrial system that made large-scale adaptation politically, financially, and organizationally difficult. That does not absolve them. But it does make the story more serious than a morality tale about fools in suits. Some of Dunlop's leaders made poor choices. Some were trapped by the narrowing menu of choices left to them by earlier decisions. Usually, industrial collapse is both things at once. What workers saw, meanwhile, was simpler. Numbers fell. Confidence fell. The company that had once seemed too large to worry about now looked increasingly uncertain. The giant was still standing, but it was beginning to lose the habit of winning. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dunlop had entered the most humiliating phase a great industrial company can know. The phase where it begins financing the future by selling pieces of the past. That sentence contains the whole emotional architecture of decline. When a growing company buys, expands, and builds, every transaction feels additive. When a weakening company starts disposing of land, divisions, holdings, and once prized subsidiaries, the logic reverses. Each sale may be rational. Some may even be necessary. But from the inside, and especially from the shop floor, the pattern creates a specific sensation. The sensation that the company is eating itself in order to continue for a little longer. Plantation interests were sold. Overseas operations were sold. Workforces were cut. Modernization still required money. The debts accumulated by earlier choices did not vanish merely because assets changed hands. Dunlop was no longer acting like an empire shaping its markets. It was acting like a large patient trying to stabilize itself while giving away organs. This is where the mythology of British industrial decline becomes most misleading. People often imagine collapse as a single clean break. In reality, it is usually a drawn-out administrative process. The company goes on existing. Headlines still use the old name. Products still appear. The buildings still stand. Yet internally, the system has shifted from construction to liquidation. That is exactly the point when workers begin to understand something managers rarely say plainly. Survival of the company name and survival of their own future are no longer the same thing. There are moments in business history so symbolic that they feel almost fictional. One of them came in 1983. Decades earlier, Dunlop had helped establish manufacturing operations in Japan. Those operations grew over time into Sumitomo Rubber Industries, long associated with the Dunlop name in Japan and increasingly capable in their own right. The Imperial Center had built outposts. That was normal enough. What was not normal was what followed. By the early 1980s, Sumitomo was profitable, technically serious, and far less compromised than its British progenitor. Dunlop, by contrast, was burdened by debt, weakened by years of strategic error, and forced into radical retrenchment. So Dunlop sold its loss-making European tire business to Sumitomo. The subsidiary, in a historical sense, bought the heart of the parent. It is difficult to imagine a cleaner symbolic verdict on decades of decline. The company that had once radiated technical authority outward now had to cede its core industrial inheritance to a business it had earlier helped create. The transfer was reported as commerce, which of course it was. But commerce is sometimes history's coldest form of judgment. You can tell yourself the transaction is rational. The arithmetic may even be correct. Yet the meaning remains devastating. Dunlop had failed to invest decisively enough in the future. Sumitomo had not. Dunlop had carried the costs of its hesitation. Sumitomo had accumulated the benefits of moving more effectively. After that, the disassembly accelerated. Factories in other parts of the world were sold. Assets that had once formed a coherent global manufacturing system were broken up. In 1985, BTR acquired what remained of Dunlop, and further disposals followed. The company that had once stood among the world's industrial heavyweights no longer existed as an integrated empire. It existed as a collection of saleable parts and enduring trademarks. This is one of the hardest things for communities to live through. A company can disappear before its name disappears. In fact, the name often survives precisely because it is detachable. The workforce is not detachable. The place is not detachable. The name is. And so the people who had built Dunlop watched the symbol remain visible even as the substance was sold away beneath it. Large-scale tire manufacturing at Fort Dunlop wound down in the 1980s, but that did not mean the story ended cleanly. What followed was a long industrial afterlife. The great building remained. Specialist production continued in parts of the site. Motorsports tires, motorcycle tires, specialist products, smaller, more focused operations carried on where once an industrial city had existed under one corporate name. The old totality was gone, but remnants persisted. There is something haunting about this phase in industrial history. The main force has ebbed away, but fragments continue. The building is still there. Some workers are still there. The sign is still there. The memory of the old scale remains close enough that every reduced operation feels both like survival and like evidence of what has already been lost. Fort Dunlop itself spent years semi-derelict before redevelopment transformed the landmark building into offices, retail space, and a hotel. Urban Splashes project in the 2000s rescued the structure physically and gave it a new commercial life. That part of the story deserves honesty. Without redevelopment, the building might simply have decayed further. The architecture was saved. But saving architecture and saving industrial meaning are not the same thing. By the time offices opened inside the restored shell, white-collar workers were arriving through spaces once defined by manufacturing. Emails replaced output. Service sector rhythms replaced industrial rhythms. This was not a moral failure. Cities change. Buildings adapt. But it was a civilizational change of type, and that distinction matters. The old Dunlop name still glowed over the facade. Yet the thing beneath the name had become fundamentally different. Britain has done this many times over the last half-century. Factories become apartments, offices, leisure complexes, retail parks, cultural venues. The exterior survives. Sometimes the machinery is removed so completely that the new occupants do not even know what once happened under the same roof. The country becomes very good at preserving the silhouette of labor while forgetting labor itself. Fort Dunlop became one of the clearest examples of that transformation. The sign remained iconic. The industrial order it once represented had already gone. There is a modern British habit of praising regeneration without asking what, exactly, has been regenerated. Fort Dunlop is a perfect example. The building was saved, and that is not trivial. A major industrial landmark avoided demolition, acquired new investment, and returned to use. Architects, planners, and developers can legitimately point to that outcome as better than dereliction or oblivion. They are right as far as they go. But regeneration stories often become visually persuasive at exactly the moment they become historically evasive. A restored facade, a new office floor, a hotel, a gym, cafes, parking, branding, design awards, these things create a neat narrative of recovery. What they do not recover is the industrial world that made the place necessary in the first place. They recover land value. They recover architectural viability. They do not recover the old relation between building, labor, and community. This matters because post-industrial societies can become sentimental about ruins while remaining indifferent to workers. They like the old sign. They like the exposed brick. They like the skyline presence, the atmospheric story, the gesture toward heritage. But the people who gave the place meaning are often treated as background to the building's second life. And so the memory begins to warp. The site becomes known as a landmark office conversion rather than as one of the great centers of rubber manufacturing in Britain. The sign becomes a design feature. The fort becomes a location. The worker becomes a footnote. It is one more kind of disappearance. Not the disappearance of matter, but the disappearance of emphasis. And still, even then, one last thread remained. Dunlop Motorsport continued producing tires in Birmingham into the 21st century. Specialist, high skill, low volume by comparison with the old mass era, but real manufacturing, real workers, real continuity. This was not just branding. Tires were still being made. By 2013 and 2014, that too was ending. The closure was not presented as epic or ideological. It came in the clipped language modern corporations reserve for irreversible decisions: lease expiry, production transfer, existing facilities elsewhere, supply continuity, efficiency. The site landlord had sold the land to Jaguar Land Rover. Goodyear Dunlop, which then controlled the European Dunlop brand within a joint venture structure, chose to move production to Germany and France rather than secure a new home in Birmingham. Around 300 jobs were affected, with roughly 180 tied directly to manufacturing. Politicians protested. Jack Dromey, the local member of parliament, denounced the decision and argued that alternatives within Birmingham had existed. The criticism was not abstract. Britain still mattered in motorsport. Skills still mattered. Heritage still mattered. But heritage is weak when set against a spreadsheet that says the work can be absorbed somewhere else more cheaply. And here the story arrives at one of its bleakest modern truths. The final decision that ended 125 years of Dunlop manufacturing in Birmingham was not made by the city, or by the workers, or by the communities who had lived with the company for generations. It was made inside a global corporate structure tied to Goodyear far away from Erdington, in the orbit of Akron, Ohio. Rationally, perhaps. Administratively, certainly. But distance changes the ethical temperature of a decision. The farther power moves from a place, the easier it becomes to describe a local ending as an operational adjustment. Workers continued through their final months knowing the end date. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of ending. Not sudden enough for shock. Not hopeful enough for denial. Just enough time to keep doing the work while understanding that every finished tire is bringing the place closer to silence. On May 30th, 2014, the line stopped. No great national ritual marked the moment. The last tire was not the kind of object a country places in a museum with proper solemnity. Yet, in historical terms, it deserved to be. Because what ended that day was not just one specialist operation. It was the final manufacturing link between Birmingham and a company that had once helped define the industrial identity of the city itself. After that, there was nothing left of Dunlop's maker in Birmingham except memory, architecture, and the name. One of the most unsettling parts of the Dunlop story is that Dunlop did not vanish. The company vanished. The integrated industrial system vanished. The Birmingham manufacturing base vanished. But the name did not. You can still buy Dunlop tires. You can still encounter Dunlop in sport. The brand migrated, split, recombined, licensed itself across continents and categories, and ultimately proved more durable than the organization that first gave it power. In May 2025, Goodyear completed the sale of its remaining Dunlop brand rights for four-wheel tires in Europe, North America, and Oceania to Sumitomo Rubber Industries, consolidating more of the brand under the Japanese company that had already become central to the story decades earlier. That is an extraordinary arc. The invention began in Belfast. The industrial empire was built through Britain and Birmingham. The parent declined. The subsidiary in Japan became first a buyer, then a long-term steward of major parts of the name. The brand now circulates globally in ways detached from the old British corporate body that made it famous. This is the modern fate of many great industrial names. They become portable assets. Traditions without a homeland. Heritage without the workforce that created it. The public continues to see continuity where, underneath, discontinuity has become almost total. There is a temptation to say that this proves brands are more important than factories. In a narrow financial sense, perhaps that is often true. In a civilizational sense, it is nonsense. A brand can survive without a city. A city cannot live on brand survivals alone. The material world still has to be made somewhere, by someone, under some set of labor conditions, inside some community that will either benefit from that work or one day mourn its departure. The Dunlop name outlived Dunlop the company because names are easier to move than people, equipment, local identity, or industrial memory. A name has no commute, no children in the local school, no sense of betrayal. No view from the road approaching the factory at dawn. It goes where ownership says it goes. That is precisely why names can mislead us. They preserve recognition while concealing rupture. So what was Dunlop, in the end? Not just tires. That answer is too small. Dunlop made one of the clearest British examples of how industrial success can harden into industrial vulnerability. It made a cityscape. It made a labor culture. It made technical prestige. It made wages for generations of Birmingham families. It made racing victories, transport systems, military supply, export earnings, and the quiet daily confidence of a society that assumed large things would continue to be made at home because large things had always been made at home. And then, by failing to change fast enough, by entangling itself in strategic solutions that answered the wrong questions, and by allowing the logic of global cost to supersede the meaning of local continuity, it also made its own disappearance. This is not just a story about bad management, though management failure is part of it. It is not just a story about changing technology, though technology is central. It is not just a story about Britain's post-war industrial decline, though it belongs there too. It is the story of what happens when success becomes structure and structure becomes hesitation. The men in the boardroom did not intend to erase Birmingham's Dunlop future. The workers on the factory floor did not intend to inherit a long redundancy stretched across decades. The customers who diversified suppliers did not intend to destroy an empire. The property developers who repurposed Fort Dunlop did not intend to erase the dignity of what had once been made there. History usually destroys in pieces, by means of decisions that each make sense to somebody. That is why stories like this are so hard to absorb. If the villain were simple, the lesson would be easy. Instead, the Dunlop story leaves us with a more serious conclusion. Industrial civilizations can lose themselves through a chain of understandable decisions, each one defensible in isolation, catastrophic in accumulation. The collapse of Dunlop as a British industrial force matters for more than corporate reasons. It matters because it reveals a deeper change in what Britain became after the war. There was a time when companies like Dunlop, ICI, GEC, Lucas, and the great shipbuilders and steel firms formed not just an economy but an expectation. The expectation was that Britain would continue to design, make, test, and export serious physical things at scale, and that whole districts of whole cities would continue to organize themselves around those capabilities. The expectation was not naive. It had been earned over generations. What broke in the second half of the 20th century was not simply one company's balance sheet. It was the confidence structure behind that expectation. Once that breaks, a country can continue looking prosperous while becoming fundamentally different. Office districts can rise where factory districts fell. Service output can replace manufacturing output on paper. Some regions can thrive spectacularly, while others are asked to absorb the quiet humiliation of becoming landscapes where things used to be made. Dunlop's story belongs to that national transition. The company did not fail because Britain stopped needing tires. The world kept needing tires. It failed, in the British sense, because the institutional, financial, technological, and strategic conditions required to keep making them competitively at scale were not secured well enough, soon enough, or for long enough. Other places took the work. The demand survived. The place lost the right to fulfill it. That is one of the most painful truths in industrial history. Demand does not guarantee local survival. Need does not guarantee continuity. Even national significance does not guarantee rescue. The world still wanted what Dunlop knew how to make. It simply did not have to be made in Birmingham anymore. Drive past Fort Dunlop today, and the sign still announces itself to the motorway. The building still has force. The name still has weight. The old confidence is still there in concrete form, hanging over the road as if the age that produced it has merely stepped out for lunch and might return at any moment. But it is a false continuity. Inside, the work is different. The people are different. The rhythms are different. The empire that once made the building necessary is gone. What remains is the shell, the symbol, and the uneasy prestige of survival after purpose has changed. Somewhere else, in other countries, under other ownership structures, machines still produce Dunlop-branded tires. The name continues its travels. It will probably continue for a very long time. Longer, perhaps, than most of the people who remember what Birmingham once meant to it. That is the final sadness of the Dunlop story. A veterinary surgeon solved a child's discomfort on a Belfast street. Engineers, workers, managers, clerks, drivers, planters, mechanics, salesmen, and machinists turned that solution into one of the great industrial names of modern Britain. Birmingham gave it scale. Labor gave it reality. Success gave it reach. And yet in the end, what endured most cleanly was not the company, not the workforce, not the city that had built its monumental home. It was the logo. The sign still glows. The fort does not.